Hi, everyone. Good afternoon to those of you in the United States. Good evening to those of you in Israel and other places. I'd like to welcome you to this Makor conversation. You realize, of course, that we didn't intend on having these Makor conversations 3 or 4 months ago, but as Corona started spreading around the world, it became clear that people stopped traveling. And as no one is coming to Israel, we thought we'd try and share some of Israel with you. And so our conversation this evening is about Israel's legal system. More behind the scenes of Israel's legal system with Joey Asch, an attorney who just retired from the state's attorney's office. He was the director of the criminal division, basically the division that makes the most significant decisions on criminals above a certain level in all of Israel. Before that, he served in the district attorney's office in Jerusalem. He is a native of the United States. His family made Aliyah when Joey was 3 years old. He was educated in Jerusalem, went to the Hebrew University. In between, he served in the army as a naval commando. And he really has been involved in some of the most significant cases that Israel has seen, not just on the national level while he's been in the state's attorney's office, but also as Jerusalem and serving in Jerusalem's district attorney's office. He will not be able to share with us some of the intricate details of the decisions that he was part of, such as the indictment of Prime Minister Netanyahu and others, but he will be able to talk to us about the structure of the legal system and pinpoint some of the more difficult issues that have been facing Israeli society as of late, both having to do with the Supreme Court, as well as the role of the Attorney General, the relationship between the Knesset and the judiciary, and all of this coming from his personal perspectives. I will say also that the recording of this presentation kicked in a little late. The first few minutes of Joey's presentation had to do with some of the challenging issues that he faced, serving on the one hand within the prosecutorial system, on the one hand, and on the other hand, being an individual, watching as many different sources and places within Israeli society attacked the legal system, and him knowing from within that the legal system was actually very honest, very straightforward, and just trying to do the right job. We pick up the conversation as Joey begins to discuss the makeup of the Supreme Court and how the Supreme Court is involved in Israeli society, and we're about 3 or 4 minutes into the conversation. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Joey Asch.
Strong Supreme Court, I think, is a very big achievement. And we'll start with the Supreme Court. What I'm going to do is I'm going to try and describe how the system works and why is there so much criticism around the legal system in Israel today. So the Supreme Court in Israel is very different than the Supreme Court in Washington. I actually had the honor to sit in the Supreme Court. I met in the U.S. Supreme Court. I met one of the justices. The U.S. Supreme Court presides over between 90 and 100 cases per year. The Supreme Court in Israel presides over 10,000 cases a year. That's times 100. The Supreme Court in Israel does not have the privilege to pick its cases. Whatever is brought before the Supreme Court has to be debated in one way or another. Why? Because the Supreme Court in Israel is also a court of appeals, civil law and criminal law, and labor law, anything. Any legal issue that was conducted in one of the district courts in Israel is appealed to the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court is dealing with hundreds upon hundreds of appeals. And not only that, it's also a court of administrative law, which is called in Israel Bagatz. Bagatz today is a word that is heard every other sentence on the news. Bagatz stands for the High Court of Justice. It's not a different court. It's the same judges that sit on the Supreme Court. And they can, in the morning, deal with criminal law, and then in the afternoon or at noon, civil law, and then they go on to administrative law. Many of the questions that are brought before the Supreme Court as an administrative law, we'll call it bagats, are questions that incorporate into them not only legal issues, but also values, and also sometimes, whether we like it or not, political questions, religion and state, security issues, social questions. Just yesterday, literally yesterday, I spent part of the night reading the ruling. The Supreme Court deemed a law void on an 8-1 ruling on a very, very political issue. The issue of legalizing Jewish homes that were built on Palestinian land. So this is a legal question. Is the law constitutional or is it not constitutional? But obviously, in order to answer that question, the judges have to ask themselves, is the breach of certain civilian rights for a good cause and in the public interest? So what is a good cause and what is the public interest? So here the judge must ask himself, what do I think about settlements? Because all the homes that we're talking about are in settlements. So it becomes very political. It's legitimately political, but nonetheless, it's political. And I might add, or I should add, that when the Supreme Court deals in administrative law, it has two tools, legal tools that it works with. One is simple. If the Supreme Court is deliberating a certain law, so the question is this law constitutional or not? That's pretty straightforward. The second tool is called reasonableness. That's a translation from Hebrew. Let's say the government decided something, not in a law. So the Supreme Court can determine that the decision of the government is not reasonable. What does that mean, not reasonable? It basically means if it's beyond the realm of reasonableness. Even though the court might not agree with the decision, if it's in the borders of being reasonable, so that's fine. But if the court thinks that it's not reasonable, the court is going to void the government decision. And that's a problem. It's a problem when the Supreme Court does that too many times. You should know that since 1948, only 18 laws were canceled in Israel by the Supreme Court. That's one every 4 years. So I don't know if that's a lot or a little, but all of them were since 1997. Today in the public, many people who are arguing the fact that we voted for a right-wing government because we wanted the government to decide and to have policies that we believe in. When the court does not enable the government to rule, that's a problem because we did not vote for the court and the judges are not up for elections. And I want to give a few examples from recent times, and they all accumulate till what's happening today in Israel. So most of the examples I'm going to give are literally from the past month, but I'm going to start with something a little further back from 2013. So Israel is trying to cope with a very big problem of illegal immigration from Africa. In 2018, there were over 65,000 illegal immigrants. They're situated mainly in southern Tel Aviv. And for many reasons and in many areas of life, it's causing many problems in Israeli society. And the government promised that it will deal with it. So in 2013, the government passed a law that said that the state could detain an illegal immigrant up to 3 years. In other words, without a trial, to put him in jail for 3 years until the courts determine if he should be given the status of a refugee or not. Instead of these refugees going out to work, meanwhile, they'll be in jail. So this was appealed to the Supreme Court, and September 2013, the Supreme Court held that the law is unconstitutional. You cannot detain somebody for 3 years without a trial. Now, I have to say, I read that ruling. I totally agreed with it. So in December 2013, the government changed the law. And now the law said that you can detain somebody for 1 year instead of 3 for 1 year. And also the government built a very big compound called Cholot, where after 1 year, these illegal immigrants would be transferred to this enormous compound. They can leave during the day. They had public transportation into the city of Beersheba. They can work, but they have to be back by nightfall. And the law stated that they can be held in this compound for up to 2 years. So this was also appealed to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, well, that's not constitutional either, because 20 months, I said 2 years in the compound, 20 months, it was 20 months, and the Supreme Court said 20 months is too much. 12 months is okay. It continued this way, and eventually the Supreme Court voided another law that the government passed, and by that time the government basically gave up and closed down this compound. Now, one might ask himself, who basically can determine what qualifies as constitutional or not, 20 months or 12 months? Because the Supreme Court said 20 months is not good, but 12 months is fine. And many people felt that this doesn't really feel like a really legal issue. This is about, personal morals, and the Supreme Court should not intervene anymore. In any event, the compound was closed down. Chapter 4 of this story is, about a month ago, the Supreme Court voided another law. The government tried again to deal with this big problem of illegal immigration, and this was financially. And what the law stated is that the illegal immigrants who meanwhile are working in Israel until their status is determined, the law stated that 36% of their income will be put in a bank account to be given to them only when they leave the country. So basically, the court was trying to encourage these workers, these illegal immigrants, to leave the country. This was also deemed unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. And what's interesting is that it was a 2-to-1 vote. And the judge that was in a minority basically called out to his fellow judges, and he said, look, this is the 4th time that the Supreme Court is intervening with the Knesset's work. We shouldn't be making a habit of this. That's literally what he wrote. So that's one example that drew the public to ask many questions. What's the scope of the intervention of the Supreme Court in the Knesset's work? I'll give you another example from a totally different area. Israel has a policy that terrorists who murdered Israeli citizens, the army destroys their homes. Now, it's done in a very careful manner. In other words, if the terrorist lives on the 2nd floor and his family lives on the 1st floor, the army will destroy only the 2nd floor. They do it very precisely, and that's the policy of the government. So 2 weeks ago, the Supreme Court ruled that destructing one of the homes of a terrorist who was one of the terrorists who murdered a teenager by the name of Dvir Solek a few months ago. He was murdered on the way to yeshiva, and it took a while to find the terrorists. There were a few of them. Those who were caught first, their homes were destroyed, and the last one who was captured, the army was about to destroy his home. I mean, to demolish it. And the Supreme Court said, well, too many months have passed. It was about 6 months. So it doesn't really have an effect. So it's not constitutional and you cannot do that. And again, this brought much, much animosity towards the Supreme Court. Excuse me. Because who's really to say, is it really a legal question to say that 2 months is okay, 5 months is not okay? So this again was basically a political question. It was voted 2 against 1, and the one judge who said they certainly can go forward with destroying the house was a religious judge who's known to be right-wing. So that, of course, intensified the argument that the Supreme Court is very political and mainly in one direction. The last example I'll give was probably the biggest court hearing in the last many years, and that is around the question, can a prime minister who was indicted form a government? Now, one thing you must know is there is absolutely no law that prohibits that. Not only that, the laws that deal with things that are close to that, you can learn from them that a prime minister, even though he was indicted, can still form a government. And yet, a few organizations petitioned the Supreme Court, Bagatz, to forbid Netanyahu from forming a government. The bottom line is that the Supreme Court, it was unanimous, ruled that Netanyahu can form a government, and as we all know, he did form a government. But what troubled the public is that the Supreme Court actually presided and deliberated for a full day. In other words, they really did ask themselves, can we say that 1,800,000 people who voted Netanyahu, was that vote beyond the borders of reasonableness? Many people thought that the court should have thrown this out after 1 minute. The court should have said to the people who brought the case before the court, can you show a law that prohibits this? If not, we absolutely cannot deliberate the question. So the fact that the Supreme Court actually went into debate, is this reasonable or not reasonable, frightened many citizens. And I'm not talking about people who are extreme. I'm talking about people who are good citizens and who are worried about the scope of the power of the Supreme Court. I wrote down a couple of more examples, but I think we'll go forward. And the sad part is that the result of all of this is that a large part of the population lost its trust in the Supreme Court. They don't feel that the Supreme Court is considering values that are important to them. And they feel that the Supreme Court is undermining the separation of branches. And I see that amongst people who I hold in the highest esteem, very smart people, people who are good citizens, who, like I said before, are not crazy people, and they don't believe anymore in the Supreme Court. And I think that's a very dangerous situation, because the more the Supreme Court loses its power, the checks and balances are going to go, and that's a society that obviously none of us want to live in. My personal opinion is that although a lot of the criticism on the Supreme Court is not justified. Some of it is. But there's a saying in Hebrew that says, you don't argue with feelings. And if hundreds of thousands of good citizens feel that the Supreme Court does not represent them, something has to change. And I think what should be changed is more Supreme Court justices with conservative views should be appointed to the Supreme Court. The Minister of Justice, Ayelet Shaked, started that, but she was not voted in again, and I think that it's going to stop. And paradoxically, it's a paradox because people think that she was going against the Supreme Court, and I feel that she was basically doing something to totally strengthen the power of the Supreme Court. I'll tell you a story which I think really reflects what I just said. I have a friend who lives in my community, and his father comes to visit every once in a while. And I see him in shul, in synagogue, and he's about 80 years old, very opinionated, knows a lot, very knowledgeable, and he speaks to me a lot about a lot of issues going on and legal issues. So about a year before I finished my term as the head of the criminal division, I appealed a case. I won't go into details, but generally speaking, the case was about an Israeli soldier who killed a Palestinian. He got a certain punishment, and I thought he should have gotten a much more severe punishment. And I appealed the case to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court accepted my appeal and doubled his punishment. And it was a big thing on the media, and he had a very famous defense attorney, and he was on the radio all the time stating facts that had nothing to do with the case. So my father's friend comes over to me in shul, and he said, Joey, who the hell was the jerk who appealed this case to the Supreme Court? So I swallowed and I said, actually, that would be me. And he said, how can you do that? What a stupid decision. And I said, listen, I have a feeling you have no idea what the circumstances of this case were. And I started explaining it to him, and he couldn't care less. He told me, you're not convincing me. You shouldn't have appealed it. Finally, I said, you know what? I'm going to have one more attempt to convince you that it was okay. And I told him that 2 out of the 3 judges who accepted the appeal are religious and live in Judea and Samaria. There are 2 judges like that in the whole Supreme Court. And when he heard that, he looked at me and he said, really? I said, yeah. So he said, so you know what? I have nothing more to say. He didn't care about the facts. Nothing I said would have convinced him. But once he knew that the judges who deliberated this case share some of his values, that was enough for him, even though, so to speak, he lost. And I can tell you also as a lawyer that some of the cases that I lost, certain judges you don't mind losing to because they're so smart, and you know that they consider everything that has to be considered. So if your point of view was not accepted, that's fine. So that's why I certainly think that the Supreme Court should be, they should appoint more judges that the rest, many of the population can identify with. So that is about the Supreme Court. And now I'll speak a little about the Attorney General. This is a little more complicated. The Attorney General in Hebrew is called the legal advisor or the legal counsel for the government. In other words, this is the person who advises the government when the government wants to do something or pass a law. So he's a legal advisor. And if you look in the dictionary, an advisor is somebody who gives advice, obviously. And one would think that the person who's accepting the advice can either accept the advice or not accept the advice and do something not according to the advice. With the Attorney General, that doesn't work. It's different. The Attorney General has the last word, which means that if the government wants to do A, and the Attorney General thinks that it's not a good idea, that it's not reasonable, that it's beyond the borders of reasonableness, according to the Supreme Court rulings, the government has to yield to the Attorney General's opinion. Now, I have to say, I can see a lot of good things from this existing process. On the other hand, I think it's very problematic, and I have to say, I still don't have a fully consolidated opinion on this issue. I find myself going back and forth, but I will share with you some of my some of the different points around this around the Attorney General. First of all, the Attorney General holds three powers, three authorizations. He's the head of the prosecution. One would think that the state attorney is the head of the prosecution. In Israel, it's not that. In Israel, the Attorney General is the head of the prosecution of all law enforcement, the police, the SEC in Israel, the state attorney, everything. He's the only one also who can authorize an indictment against the prime minister. So that's one big power that he has. The second is he's the state's counsel in all areas of the law, civil, administrative, international. If the state of Israel has some international legal issue, the AG, we'll call him the AG, has the final word. He's the one who decides what's the best thing to do. And the third is he's the legal counsel to all government entities. He has the final word, like I said before. Now, what that means is, or what that meant up until recent years, is that when the Attorney General said, what you want to do to the Prime Minister, what you want to do now is not good, and I'm not going to defend it in court, the government, generally speaking, would just say, okay, I'm not going to argue. I'll give you two examples. One of them is they're both pretty famous, but the first one I'm going to mention has been in the media many times recently. In 1993, there were two ministers who were indicted. And the prime minister at the time was Rabin, and he didn't want to relieve them of their positions because they were good. And he said, still, these people were indicted. They still weren't convicted. People are innocent until proven guilty. And I'm keeping them in office. And the Attorney General, his name was Yosef Harish at the time, and he told Rabin, you can't do that. You have to fire them because it's not right. People cannot be in the government under indictment. The court held, or one thing I should say, the government was not represented in court because the Attorney General did not agree with the government's decision. So the government was not represented in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court held, it was the Chief Justice Barak, that the last word is of the Attorney General, and there's nothing, once the Attorney General said no, so it's no. I'll give you another example, which really upset me at the time. The government wanted to appoint a big army general by the name of Yoav Gallant. Today he's the Minister of Education, to be the 20th Chief of Staff of the Army. This is a big general, a very brave man. I actually knew him from the Army. But then there was a media report about violations of legal rights while he built his home. In other words, he built his home on some of his house was built on public property. And he also submitted some affidavits to the court that weren't really accurate, to say the least. And the Attorney General told the government, look, you can appoint him to be the Chief of Staff. Now, I have to add that nothing was criminal. It was disgusting what he did, but it wasn't criminal. It seemed to me that the government has the right to say, we are facing a war, which, by the way, we did in the Gaza Strip. This person is the most fit to lead the army into the war. And therefore, even though he did something disgusting, which is disgusting, we still want him to be the chief of staff because he can do the job best. But the attorney general told the government, I am not defending this in court. And the government basically said, okay, so we're not going to go forward with this. And then the person who was appointed was Benny Gantz, who many thought he didn't do a great job, but that's beside the point. Now, I think that one can argue that the scope of the power of the Attorney General is very vast. And it's questionable if that is the way it should be. I'll give one more example that's pretty recent. It reached the court pretty recently. In 2018, the Minister of Science, a person by the name of Akunis, refused to appoint a big professor of biology by the name of Yael Amitai to a position in an Israeli and German research fund. Why did he refuse to appoint her, even though she had all the qualifications? Because in the year 2002, she signed a petition supporting refusal of soldiers to serve in Judea and Samaria, which is against the law. The Attorney General was not willing to back the decision of the Minister of Science, and the Minister of Science, again, was not represented in court. Not only that, the Attorney General told the Supreme Court that he thinks that the Minister of Science, his voice should not be heard at all. But the Supreme Court said, we want to hear him. So he came and he voiced his opinion. It kind of became more complicated. She still hasn't been appointed, by the way, but the court still didn't rule if it's the decision is void or not. Now, I think that one can argue that it's not a question of legal or not legal. It's a question of reasonable or not. And then, who's to say? I might agree, by the way, with the Attorney General, but I can certainly understand the people, the many, many thousands of people who think that something is wrong here. And today, the scope of the power of the Attorney General is being questioned. Why should he have the last word? Advice is advice. It's not decision-making. And once a government is voted in, so the government has to have the power to rule. And once the Attorney General and the Supreme Court are basically not allowing him to rule, so that's a problem. And like I said before, these voices are very, very loud today. They're very violent. They're very violent. The claims are that everybody is corrupt. And again, I hope that with the unity government, if you can call it a unity government, I hope that things kind of calm down. Another question that's being asked by the public is, why is the Attorney General the head of the prosecution? He's above the state attorney. It gives him basically unlimited powers. It gives him very, very sharp teeth when he says that a certain decision is unlawful. Another problem is, I don't know if there are lawyers amongst us, but it puts him in a basically impossible position. He's sitting in government meetings with these people, and he's also their lawyer. And it arouses questions of ethics between a lawyer and a client. When your lawyer is also your prosecutor, that is a problem. And like I said before, I don't really know where I stand. I think that weakening the Attorney General's power might lead certain governments to do things that are unlawful. Now, you can always say, we have the Supreme Court, and that is true. On the other hand, still, sometimes the Supreme Court cannot deliberate everything. Sometimes questions are not brought before the Supreme Court. So again, this is a big question in my opinion, and I think that these past months, the power and the esteem of the Attorney General is very, very low, personally and as an institution. And I think the population in Israel is really divided. I can tell you that I have some army friends who I meet with every once in a while. Very smart people, and many of them really do not have any faith, not in the Attorney General and not in the Supreme Court. So that's a problem that I hope will be dealt with. And if I'm thinking of what is the best way to deal with the problem with the Attorney General, with the Supreme Court, I think that more judges should be appointed, from more conservative judges. The Attorney General, I think, in Israel, I think what should solve the problem is that his powers should be defined by the law. Today, they're defined by the Supreme Court. That's not enough. The legislator has to sit down and think, what is the scope of the powers of the Attorney General? And I think that if that happens, a lot of the emotions and the animosity will become a lot less zealous. Let me see what else I wanted to talk about. The state attorney's office, obviously, since the indictment of the prime minister, has also been a target of attacks. Basically, the claim of many of the public is that the state attorney's office wanted Netanyahu out of office, so they basically put together this cockamamie indictment. And it's very funny because this claim has been said with such self-conviction, mainly by the last Secretary of Justice, Minister of Justice, that many people really believe it, and it's absolute nonsense. I see my mother is also listening to this, to what I'm saying, and I remember sitting with my parents in their kitchen in Jerusalem, and my father said, "Yeah, the legal system is looking out to get Netanyahu." And I said, "Dad, what are you talking about? It's me. You think it's a political coup? It's really," and obviously my father said, "Well, no, you're right, it's not, but still, you have to let him continue to rule." Now, I have to say, there was absolutely no political, how should I say it? The political aspect of Netanyahu's cases were absolutely not taken, not spoken about. I don't know if you know, but the Attorney General himself was the chief of staff of Netanyahu as a prime minister. The head of the police, who was in charge of all of the investigations, is a right-wing, grew up in settlements. The last thing you can say is that this was political. Case 4000. I'm not gonna speak about it, but it's a bad case. Another bad case. I mean, it's a severe case. It doesn't mean that Netanyahu can continue to be the prime minister. I thought, even though I think very badly of what he's doing to the law enforcement in Israel, I thought that once the law enables him to be a prime minister, he has to be a prime minister because he was voted in, and you can't argue with that. But the cases are cases, and I'm very happy that recently the indictment was, the trial started, and thank God that the cases are going to be, very deeply probed by a court and not by the public. So that's what's going on today in Israel. I think I touched the main things that are really in controversy, that are all over the news every single night. The Supreme Court, the Attorney General, the state attorney's office. And again, I do believe that even though everything I said, we have a strong system, changes should be made. I hope they will be made. And I hope that things, especially the Supreme Court, the public as a whole, will come back to trusting, to trust the Supreme Court. So, Ezra, how do you want to do this? You want questions?
Yeah, I think what we'll do, first of all, thank you very much. I think that we'll open it up for questions now, and I see a question or two have started coming in. I'd like to ask one first, just to get us into the questions. And that is that in what you presented, you seem to be pulling in two different directions. So on the one hand, you mentioned that you thought that what the court is missing is more conservative judges, what Ayelet Shaked wants, and also what the most recent Justice Minister Amir Ohana wants. And on the other hand, talking about in defense of the Supreme Court and the legal system, which the attacks on the legal system and the Supreme Court are coming from those very same politicians who are trying to change the nature and the makeup of the court. So it seems that on the one hand, it's almost like a push me, pull you, like from Dr. Doolittle, pulling in two different directions.
Okay, first of all, I'll say that there's nothing to compare between Ayelet Shaked, who really came to change what she thought should be changed, to Amir Ohana, who came to destroy the legal system in Israel. I'll say that again. His only sole purpose was to destroy the state attorney's office, the attorney general, and the Supreme Court because of the indictment of the prime minister. Now, what you said is true. I think the Supreme Court is a good court. There are very honest judges. I appeared before the Supreme Court many times. And the fact is that many of the justices in the Supreme Court are very liberal. They're allowed to be liberal. They don't have any malice thoughts against the state of Israel, which is what people are claiming. All I'm saying is that it has to be balanced. And if it's not balanced, a large part of the population is going to continue not to trust the Supreme Court, and that's a very bad thing. So it's true. I'm reading the Supreme Court's decision from last night, where it voided a rule of certain like 3,000 homes in Judea and Samaria, and I have to say that I totally agree and identify with the one judge who said that the law should not be void. And I'm thinking, my God, it's 8 against 1, and it's 8 liberal judges against one judge who is conservative, and the meaning and the effect it's going to have on thousands of people is immense. So it shouldn't be that way. Nonetheless, the court rules with honesty, and they're honest people, and they're very good legal minds, and so forth. So I'm somewhere in the middle.
Now moving into the questions, and we've gotten a few. One about appointment of judges. Can you just very briefly describe how judges are appointed? And maybe if you could also just compare, everybody saw what happened with Brett Kavanaugh in the United States. Is there any similarity or not?
Yes. Judges in Israel are appointed by a committee. It's by a committee of 9 people. I wrote it down actually, and I want to be accurate. First of all, it's the CEO of the Ministry of Justice. It's 3 Supreme Court justices, I think 3 Knesset members, and 2 public figures. Did I reach 9? Whatever. Now, it used to be that all the power was in the Supreme Court judges' hands. And Ayelet Shaked basically changed that. She shifted the power so the politicians would have more power. And people were saying that it's horrible because now it's going to all be political, but it has to be political. Like the United States. By the way, it took me years to reach this conclusion. I always thought that it shouldn't be political. When I say political, I mean, political and conservative and
Liberal.
And conservative. So that's the way they're appointed. They're appointed by a committee of 9, and the big question is who has the power in the committee: the Supreme Court justices or the Knesset members? So that's the way it works today.
And just staying with the court, and then we'll go on to a few other questions. Who decides within the court who gets what? How do you?
Honestly, I don't know. I do know that the head of the Supreme Court recently said that it goes according to the most senior justices first. If that is true, it's not a good system. But I don't know. I remember when I was in the state attorney's office, we always asked, how does it work? And we try to find out by asking the interns in the Supreme Court. And some people say it's done by computer, and some people say that the head of the Supreme Court decides. So I'm sorry to say, I really don't have a solid answer to that question.
There's a question, kind of shifting gears a little bit, with the woman Laufer, I believe is her name, from Australia, and where does that stand now? And the same question came from Dr. Benditson in Boston, in Florida, is how long do you expect Bibi's case to take?
Okay, the case involving the Australian woman, it took a very long time because the court had to determine if she is psychologically sound to stand trial. And I think about a month or 2 ago, the court said that she is fine. And I don't know if she was already extradited or not, but it's totally happening. And the question concerning Netanyahu, I would guess that in the district court in Jerusalem, the first round should take between 2 and 3 years. And then I'm sure there should be an appeal to the Supreme Court that can take another year. It's a long time.
Wow.
By the way, I might add that many people say that the prosecution shouldn't have indicted while he's in office, and they have what's called the French law. The French law says that you cannot investigate or indict the president, but he has 2 terms of office, and then you can do whatever you want. So that might be a good idea, by the way. I'm not against that idea, but I think that it has to come from the Knesset. The Attorney General cannot decide upon himself, well, he's doing a good job, I'm not going to indict. He doesn't have that power. That has to be by law. So if they want to legislate a law that is like the French law, that's fine, but it has to be according to law.
So actually following up on that, do you think there should be a perfect balance between the branches of government, or should there be one that's stronger than the other?
Well, I think that the Supreme Court should definitely have, it can't be a complete balance. The Supreme Court definitely should have the power to announce that certain laws are void, but it should use that power very, very carefully. Today, they want to pass a law that says, and this is also in the news all the time, they want to pass a law that says that the Knesset could pass a law even though the Supreme Court deemed that it's unconstitutional. The question is, does it need a regular majority or not? But that's what happens when the Supreme Court intervenes too much. And I actually do think that there were cases that I didn't think the Supreme Court should have gotten involved. But obviously, the state of Israel needs a very strong Supreme Court, and that's obviously the way it should be.
So I'll follow up with one last question, and that is that obviously you couldn't share with us details of the specific details of cases connected to things that you discussed. All of this conversation kind of revolves of the big elephant in the room, and that is a constitution. And do you think that if Israel had a constitution, much of this would not be happening the way it is, or that would be totally irrelevant?
Israel doesn't have a constitution, but Israel does have laws that have constitutional weight. And I'll tell you something that once a very smart minister who sat in jail for 4 years, Aryeh Deri, once said, he's a religious person, and he said, even if the Constitution of Israel was the 10 Commandments, I would vote against it. Why? Because the Supreme Court is always going to be the one to
Interpret.
Right, to interpret it. So I think the chances of having a constitution are pretty slim, even though in Canada, it's been done, and they had it very years ago, obviously, and they also had many problems, but they put it together. Trudeau managed to do it, but I don't see it happening in Israel, and I don't know if that would solve all the problems.
Great. Well, thank you very much. This is a major, major issue in Israeli society at the moment, and I'm sure it's going to go on for a long, long time. And as the prime minister's trial goes on for longer and longer, and as we change from a prime minister to a replacement prime minister, and then a prime minister with another replacement prime minister, we're all in kind of uncharted waters. And maybe a conversation in 2 years about this will be the same, and it might be different. So thank you very much. And thank you all for coming. We're going to be having another one of these conversations in a week to 10 days. And anybody that's interested, the previous conversations and this one will be up on our website. The others are there, and this one will be up on our website by tomorrow. So thank you all for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you sometime in Israel sooner rather than later.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Be
Thanks.
well. Stay healthy.
Ezra, very well done. Thank you. Outstanding.
I'll call you a little later about what you just said earlier.
But that was fascinating. Fascinating. Incredibly well done.
It was really, really excellent. Really brilliant, organized, clear, excellent. And your questions were also really, really good. Thank you very, very much.
Okay, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye, Ezra.
Bye-bye. Bye, Ezzy.
Bye. Thank you so much. It was excellent.
Oh, coming from you, Nikki, that's a big deal.
No, I have more questions. Can I email him with questions?
Sure, I'll send you as Nikki, by the way, was a guide in the Supreme Court for how many years?
10.
She ran the education department of the Supreme Court. So if anybody has any further questions about the Supreme Court, you can actually ask her.
I just did a Zoom for Isra guides on it. It's also taped.
Okay, great.
Thanks so much. He was fantastic. Thanks.
Nice
Bye.
job.
Thanks a
Thanks,
lot.
Iz.
Great
Excellent.
job.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.